Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more extra history, and this time, part two of their Battle of Kursk series, this time, preparations. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you join the Discord, follow me over at Twitch, and please do go check out the two gaming channels here on YouTube. One is long-form content, just the streams, uploaded raw and wriggling. You watch Lord of the Rings, you know that one. And then the other channel, there's a fucking gnat. See it. The other one is edited content of said streams. There's, as of uploading this, there might be, hold on, I'm trying to think of, as of uploading this, there will be 4 videos, I think, on that channel. There will be 2 of which Elden Ring, one a bit of a longer Elden Ring video, like 10 minutes or so. Another one's only 2 minutes. That one was a dumb short video I wanted to make. And then there's a Fallout 4 and a Tales of Kenzera video. I think they're pretty good. They're alright for my skills, and I think they're good in, like, when you look at my capabilities when it comes to video editing. I think they're decent. Anyways, yapping done. Let's go ahead and dive into, well, the preparations for the Battle of Kursk.
Today, I'd like to kick this off by doing something we rarely get to do. You see, wargaming employs a fellow named Richard Cutland, aka the Challenger. He's an ex-British tankie who served 30 years, both in peace and during war, and now he's a military specialist for wargaming. And we figured, why not invite him on to talk about how tanks evolved from the beginning of Barbarossa to the Battle of Kursk, to discuss the types of tanks and the mechanized weaponry present there, to give us a picture of how the German and Soviet tanks fared against one another, and to discuss the effects of winter and weather on armored combat of the day. So, Richard Cutland, why don't you set the scene for us?
My pleasure. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans weren't expecting much from their opponents' tank forces, which were mostly composed of old T-26 and BTs. But little did they know the most advanced Soviet tank models, the brand new KV-1 and T-34, were actually superior to all German tanks. The German standard
Ooh, take that, Germany.
anti-tank weapons were found to be ineffective against these new Soviet vehicles. Still, these tanks were not available in great numbers. Their deployment was still incomplete when Barbarossa commenced. By 1941, the Red Army had deployed 1,000 T-34s and over 500 KV tanks, concentrated in only 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. Plus, the Soviet numerical advantage in heavy equipment was thoroughly offset by the superior training and organization of the Wehrmacht. Soviet tank units were rarely well equipped. They lacked training and logistical support. Units were sent into combat with no arrangements in place for refueling, ammunition, resupply, or personal replacement.
It's always interesting when you really think of it, like, when we hear about, because oftentimes, like, especially, children, young kids, teens, etc., learning about World War II, part of it comes to, the myth around German superiority in the early days in the early half of the war, or well, first 2 years of the war, really, is about it. There's this myth of them having superior, like, we want to try and justify how they could do what they did, and so we give them oh, they had to have, like, better equipment or whatever, and then you learn the truth, and it's like, no, they didn't. Especially against France, they did not have better equipment at the time when they invaded France. Obviously, at the start of the war with the Russians, they had mostly better equipment, I would say. But then, as we're talking about here, the Russians had better equipment eventually, and they caught up fairly quick with it. But what it comes down to, really, the German superiority is the training that they had. Their ability for organization is what allowed them to so thoroughly kick France's ass, because France was disorganized. And part of me wants to know why we focus less on that. Like, that is a part that is rarely talked about as to, like, when people are asking the why Germany was so successful, we don't just talk about the German military was just extremely well organized, a well-oiled machine. They made up for their lesser equipment with their training. And maybe it has to do with uh, civilians like me, uh, you know, not really understanding, not studying enough of war to understand just how much organization can actually play a role in it, right? I would say I've studied enough of it to understand that, have a very pretty good understanding as to, you know, kind of how it works, um, without having experienced the traumas of it. Um, but right, like we that's never really talked about when talking about German supremacy in the first like 2 years of World War II. It's almost always like we put the blame on the French, um, and we avoid talking about their superior equipment. It's almost as if we're trying to like um, hold some sort of high ground that bad people can't be like organized or like can't be a run well machine. I don't know. It does like why don't we talk about that? Random tangent.
Often,
Continuing
after
on.
a single engagement, units were destroyed or rendered ineffective. But on the German side, their few encounters with the powerful Soviet KV-1s and T-34s raised clear warning signs. They sent a special Panzer Commission to the Eastern Front on 20th of November 1941 to study and learn from the superior Russian T-34s. The Germans now realised the advantage of sloped armour, which either deflected or reduced the impact of armoured-piercing shells. They introduced longer guns for the Panzer IV and added side skirts to protect the vehicles from anti-tank rifles. By the summer of 1943, right in time for the Battle of Kursk, the Wehrmacht was being equipped with the fruits of this research. The Tiger and Panther tanks were
Hitler himself insisted the Tiger be mounted with an 88mm gun. And then as we learned from potential history, what he talked about was like, yeah, no, the Germans like to add shit as they were going along, so it wasn't the building of the tanks, while the German Wehrmacht itself was a fairly well-run machine. Obviously, by 1943, that starts to come apart a bit. Their production lines were not.
introduced, as was the new Ferdinand tank destroyer. Hitler focused heavily on these new designs, which he believed were the key to victory, and matched them with an increase in manpower. By the summer of 1943, 2/3 of the German army were based in Russia. That belief paid early dividends. When the Panther tank first appeared on the battlefields of the Eastern Front, the Soviets did not have an effective weapon to counter it. During the Battle of Kursk, it demonstrated that it could destroy any Soviet armoured fighting vehicle from long distance. As a result, it had a very high overall kill ratio, despite making up less than 7% of the estimated 2,400 to 2,700 total armoured fighting vehicles deployed by the Germans in this battle. But at the same time, it had been rushed to the field unready. Many units failed due to mechanical problems, and the Panther alone could not punch through the Soviets' layered defence system at Kursk. Even heavier tank designs like the Tiger were not a total win for Nazi Germany. While superior engineering-wise, they weren't easy to manufacture, which made them not suitable for wartime economics. You see, heavy tanks aren't that hard to make, you just add more of everything, but they're expensive, and they're hard to maintain, and they bog down, so they're only useful in certain situations. Indeed, the Soviets also had tanks comparable to the Tiger, the IS-2, plenty used, and they were also similar, big, deadly, and not really worth it. On the Soviet side, their research had focused on a new medium tank, called the T-43, but it had been commissioned back in 1942 to counter the Panzer IV, and it did not have enough firepower or armour protection to go up against Germany's new Panther. Many within the Soviet High Command believed the war effort would be better served by simply making more of the same T-34s that they had introduced at the start of the war. T-34s had the advantage of being faster and more nimble than the larger German tanks. The Soviets used them to their advantage by massing tanks and running them at full speed against German positions. The Germans could destroy a Soviet tank before the Soviet tank could get into range, about 2 kilometers versus 1 kilometer. So in the end, the tanks of both countries wound up being pretty comparable. No one nation had clearly superior tank technology. What the Soviet Union did have, however, was a clearly superior industrial force. They outproduced the Germans. So the biggest difference by far between Soviet and German tanks is
I want one thing, because obviously it's not a, and it'll never be a 1-to-1 ratio, of course. But part of me is like, just the curious part of my mind wants to know what German production could have been like had they instead adopted the Soviet and American, really the Allied sort of means of production, where it's more streamlined and they're not kind of changing things and adding things as they go. Like, obviously that probably would not have, it may not have even had a significant change in the war, just because of the manpower and industrial size of both Soviet Russia and the United States in comparison to Germany, right? Germany could not at all in any alternate reality be able to compete with those two nations' industrial sectors, right? But, a part of me is like, would there have, like, what kind of change perhaps would that have caused, if any? Would that have made the Soviets more panicky? Like, would we have seen German victories in places where they did not win, or just would it not have any effect whatsoever?
is that more of the former existed. Their home terrain also gave the Soviets an advantage. The Kursk region was famous for its black earth, which produced considerable dust when dry. These huge dust clouds would cut off the powerful German air support from the battlefield, and since the Soviet defenders were stationary, they were able to set up better observation points to scout and target their enemies. Even when it rained, huge thunderstorms turned the ground into a muddy quagmire that halted the German offensive where speed was essential. The home ground advantage combined with preparation time had clearly played in the favour of the defenders. Now I'll kick it back to Dan, but first I want to say a huge thank you to the Extra History team. It's been an absolute privilege to work with you and to be part of this animated journey through history. To all the viewers, I wish you well and hope you find this series both entertaining and informative. And a final comment from the Royal Tank Regiment's motto, fear naught.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, now that we're a little more familiar with the hardware involved, let's round this episode out with a little more of the run-up to what would so famously be known as the Battle of Kursk. Last we left off, German forces had been pushed back from Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht 6th Army had been surrounded and destroyed, and the Soviets had taken the offensive. But reeling from this defeat, Hitler finally gave full operational control to his general in charge of Army Group South, Erich von Manstein. Manstein decided to trade territory for time and accept retreat on a scale Hitler never would have the year before. His plan was to lure the Soviets forward until there was a time and place where he could pounce on an overextended Soviet line. He found that opportunity at Kharkov. As the Soviets pushed forward past the city, Manstein's reorganized and reinforced panzer divisions fell on their flanks. They rapidly encircled and cut off pockets of the Red Army. Soon the city of Kharkov was back in their hands. The Soviet losses were nothing like they were at the outset of the war, but losing 85,000 soldiers in a matter of weeks at the cost of a mere 10,000 German casualties seemed like it.
Yeah, no, because let's see. Yeah, that's a decent trade-off, right? I mean, that's a really good trade-off for the Germans. But by 1943, any sort of, right, the Germans are kind of back into a similar boat that they were in World War I, where they don't really have the manpower to reinforce any sort of losses. But again, 85-10 is still pretty good. But also the Soviets had a population of like 120 million at this time. Germans were around 60-something million, I think. So, double the population.
It might signal the possibility of the initiative falling back into German hands. But 85,000 on a front of nearly 2 million men wasn't enough to change the flow of the war. The Soviets didn't lose their nerve or pull back after these losses. They were on a grim march forward to Berlin. Something else, something much more drastic would have to be done to put Germany back on the offensive. But as the battle lines evened out after the rapid German assault, everyone noticed one thing. There was a 100-mile long and 160-mile deep salient, or bulge, in the Russian lines around the town of Kursk. Cutting off this salient would strengthen the German position, deal a real blow to the Soviet army in the south, and if it could be done swiftly and decisively, return the initiative to the German forces. An attack on the Kursk salient was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. So join us next time for Operation Citadel, when the battle for Kursk begins.
Ooh. And that was the Battle of Kursk Preparations Extra History Part 2. I think I enjoyed this episode a bit more than Part 1. Mainly because it wasn't as fast paced of an episode. It felt a lot more balanced, right? So yeah, I've got nothing else to add here at the end though. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.